the occupation of Baghdad, and then from 945 to 1503, the founding of the Safavid Empire, and then from 1503 to the present. How come all these, all these different periodizations?
Well, the trouble is that I'll tell you, it's dynastic chaos. And the fact is that there was a chaotic situation of a kaleidoscope of different dynasties. For example, you will notice often a periodization ends with the fall of Baghdad to the Mongols in 1258. And so that's taken as the end of the caliphate. But the caliphate had been functionally defunct for centuries before that. And although the caliphs had come back in the last 100 years before that and reasserted their rule in Baghdad itself, all they were rulers of a tiny little principality in the center of the world, the Muslim world. That they were not rulers anywhere else. So such a periodization would have no relevance to Muslim North Africa or Muslim India, or for that matter, Egypt or Syria, or, very little relevance. Now, it is true that in the period of the medieval synthesis, which I really haven't gotten to as I'm lumbering along at my usual snail's pace, you have several things of significance that happen. I mean, after 750, you have the Abbasid Caliphate. So Abbasids are 750. Actually, technically 749. They were proclaimed in 749, so why don't we be exact? To 1258. So they existed for 509 years by that count, but what were they really? It went through a lot of gyrations, and there was a continuous disintegration after they took power. What was the end of effective Abbasid rule? It's hard to date it. But what happened was that there was a military coup in 861, which killed the caliph, Mutawakkil, and that led in the following decade to the desertion of Egypt, Syria, Arabia. Most of the provinces were lost. And then later there was a little bit of reconstruction, but then they disintegrated again quickly. So if you look 749 to 861, that's only 112 years. And even by 861, great areas had already seceded. Tunisia went in 800, Yemen went in 819, Khorasan went in 822. I think, if I remember right, Pakistan or Sindh went in 843. So, they were just falling apart at the seams all over the place, even before that date. And that brought in a series of military rulers who compromised the Abbasid caliph's actual control. Although there were a few caliphs, well, there was mainly one caliph that came back, Mu'tadid, who ruled only for 10 years, 892 to 902, and he kind of restored his rule a little bit, but it was more of like one of a bunch of competing princelings. And then the much later restoration that took place just in the last century before this, that was purely local in Iraq. So to measure things by the Abbasid dynasty, that doesn't really make much sense, really, because it didn't have much effect overall on people. And there were, however, some major events that really disturbed things. Now, the date 945 that you suggested, that's sort of like the triumph of the Shia, which was a momentary political triumph that the Shia, starting in 909 with the founding of the Fatimids till 945, where the Shi'ahs captured Baghdad, that was sort of an eruption into Sunnism. So that produced a certain theme for a while. And then that was reversed in 1055 when the Seljuk Turks took Baghdad and restored Sunnism. And then you have, of course, the Mongols. So the Mongols' eruption into the Muslim world started in exactly 1218, and it sort of dominated that century, in effect. And the Mongols conquered and destroyed Baghdad in 1258. And then the Khan, some of the Khans had flip-flopped about whether they would be Muslims, and then Ghazan became Muslim in 1295 decisively, so that you could say that after that the Mongols were part of Islam, at least the Middle Eastern ones. And so the Mongol eruption was a huge defeat for the Muslims that was vastly worse than anything that the Crusaders inflicted on the Muslims. The Crusaders, of course, there was the main Western European Christian success against the Muslims was the reconquest of Spain. That was something of great importance, of course. And the Muslims lost Spain in a series of stages. But that was somewhat compensated for by the Turks conquering Anatolia from the East Roman Empire. And then that area became the basis of Turkey and became Muslim. But after that, you have the three empires you referred to. Okay, I've run out of space here, so if we just jump over this here. The three empires you were referring to are the so-called gunpowder empires, the Ottoman Empire of 1299 to 1922, and the Safavid Empire of 1500 to I think 1732, and the Mughal Empire in India, which is, well, it was so intermittent because it would come and go and so on. So it was like 1526 to 1536, and then, well, anyway, we'll just give the overall 1526 to in effect, say about 1712, when it was the end of Bahadur Khan's reign, and after that it became very small and weak, although it theoretically existed in some form until 1858, when the British deposed the last of the Mughal emperors. So you did have the three empires as a kind of temporary theme dominating. And also the Ottomans play an important role because to some extent, they put things back together that had fallen apart. The Ottoman Empire is, by all means, the most successful Muslim state that ever existed.
When you said the Muslims lost Spain, is it better to say something like the caliphate lost Spain?
Well, in the case of Spain,
What period were you talking about?
Well, what period was I talking about? Well, I'll tell you. The Muslim emirate in Spain, first the Muslims conquered Spain in 711 after a single battle. And virtually all of Spain surrendered just on the spot. And the kings of Spain had been the Visigothic kings, who also were unpopular because although they had become Catholics eventually, their Aryan past was remembered by the Romano-Spanish population, the people who were basically Latin Spaniards, and they disliked the Visigoths as alien rulers. So the Visigoths, as elsewhere, collapsed because they were unpopular with the population, and the population didn't resist the Muslims. That is, the political rule of the Muslims. But Spanish Christianity did resist, and the Muslims were not quite able to conquer every bit of Spain. There was a place called the Rock of Covadonga in the north near Oviedo, which held out, supposedly. Although it's not quite certain that it held out every minute. But anyhow, the political disorders that led to Spain becoming independent from the Ummayyids from 745, that is from the caliphate. And then the Ummayyids came there fleeing and ended up becoming the local rulers. It's almost like they flipped, see. Because Spain had separated from the Umayyad Caliphate, so it was non-Umayyad and the rest was Umayyad. And the Umayyad fled over there, so the Caliphate became non-Umayyad and Spain became Umayyad. It was almost like an exchange of situations. And then there were various wars with the Christians, because the disorders had allowed the Christians to establish a state in Galicia in northwest Spain. And after that, the Muslims were very powerful until the year 1009, when suddenly all hell broke loose. There was just a terrible civil war that broke out, and the Spanish state that had been a unified Spanish Muslim state divided into 30 little principalities that were all fighting each other. The Spanish Christians were slow to take advantage of that. And so they conquered Toledo in the center of the peninsula in 1085. And then the decisive battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, the Spanish Christians defeated the Muslims, and Cordoba fell in 1236, and Sevilla or Seville in 1248. And then behind the mountains in Granada, the Muslims held out until 1492.
But can I interrupt for a moment? What I'm after is this. You seem to distinguish often between the profane government that is attacking, okay, maybe under the guise of the caliph, and Muslims, okay? So that's what I was after.
Yes,
because
I'm ready to answer. I know what you're after. That, here I seem to be associating the government of the place with the religion.
Yes.
And so the conflict is portrayed that way.
seem right.
Of all the places in the Muslim world, the place where that coincidence occurs is mostly in that place, and is less in every other place. Only in North Africa, which was the part of westernmost Islam that remained Muslim, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, only in North Africa did Christianity vanish 100%. Only in Spain was Islam expelled and eliminated 100%, where it had been before. So yes, so obviously the ideological split, the demand for outward conformity and so on was much greater there. And it was there, of course, the Muslims and the Jews were given the choice of either leaving the country or becoming Christians. And so nominally, after a certain date, I think in the early 1500s, there were no there were no Muslims or Jews in Spain any longer, none.
After what time?
Well, maybe it wasn't until about 1600. I think it was in the reign of Philip III or IV. Yeah, Philip III. It must have been in his reign. So it would be about 1600 maybe, that finally they were forced to convert. And a lot left and went east and migrated to the Ottoman Empire, or the Muslims went to Morocco. And maybe some of the Jews went to Morocco too, because Morocco had 3% Jews in recent times, and say up until 1950 or so. And so there, that was more of a defining difference. It is true, however, that when the Spanish Christian kings conquered the Muslims at first, for some centuries there were still Muslims practicing Islam there. And it's also true that under the Muslim rule, the Christians were there, and the Jews. That is, they were definitely present. And they were a very large presence. It's very questionable whether the Muslims were ever a majority in Spain. It seems that they weren't, and that is what accounts for the failure of Islam to remain there, see, as a religion. But elsewhere, the process of conversion went on apace, and so you had you have some histories now written, and so you have some efforts to estimate by various means, which are all not absolutely historically certain, but involve a great deal of study and erudition, the time by which a certain country became 50% Muslim. So Egypt became 50% Muslim more than 300 years after the Muslim conquest of Egypt. And that means for more than 300 years, the majority of the population were Coptic Christians. And it means eventually the Coptic Christians started to come over to Islam, and they did so very slowly. So in 300 years, about 50% of the population became Muslims. And there was a very small Muslim immigration into Egypt. So there were, of course, Muslim officials, and so Muslim Arabs immigrated to Egypt, and so a few Copts became Muslims early on, but very, very few. Generally, the Copts remained solidly Christian till about 300 years. 50% of them by then. Say after about 100 years, they started to become Muslims, and then by 300 years, 50% had become Muslims, and by 600 years, the Copts reached their present percent. And for some reason, since then, they have declined slightly. And that was 7%, and now it has declined to 6%. And you will always see in American newspapers and sources that the Copts are 10, 12, 15, 20, 25, 30, or 50% of the population of Egypt, and that is untrue. And there are Christian researchers, in fact, who have researched that and say that is absolutely inadmissible for the number of Copts in Egypt, because the censuses of Egypt, which have been a constant series since 1897, have internal consistency, and the earliest censuses were carried out by the British colonizer, not by the Egyptian government or Egyptian Muslims. And so the first census turned back a return of 7% Copt population, and so it has gone. And now they've declined somewhat because of immigration and because they have more urbanism in their population and therefore a lower birth rate. But anyway, so say 6-7% of the population remain Christian, and that's still true, and that's several million people, because Egypt has a population of 65 million today. And also, by the way, it's the most densely populated country on the earth in population density per square mile. Its cities are the most densely populated cities on the earth, and historically, it has usually been the most densely populated place on the earth since pharaonic times.
Also the Mexico City?
Yep. It has 1.5 times the population density of in the city of Cairo, in the heavily populated quarters, 1.5 times the density of Mexico City, Bombay, Calcutta, Shanghai, Beijing, Jakarta. It's more densely populated. There are some parts of Cairo that have 250,000 people per square mile.
Tim, the area around Mexico City wasn't populated densely until about 1310. So you go back way farther that's why Cairo, that's what you're saying, right? For historical times?
Yes, but I don't know about the cities, if they were always more densely populated. Today they are, I believe. But the land area of Egypt is so fertile, and it's been so densely its soil was renewed by the Nile flood until 1902, when the Low Aswan Dam was built. And it has just been able to, you can have 3 crops a year because it never quite freezes there in most of the land. So it has a year-round growing season, extremely fertile, and it's always had a very, very dense population. And that matters a lot because it means Egypt's contribution to history is enormous. Not just the pharaonic civilization of Egypt either. And the Islamic civilization has been an enormous contribution, and the Christian civilization, its contribution to Christology and the Church Fathers' writings and setting Christianity on its course, very important. Okay. In Syria, the population reached 50% Muslim in about 1200, after about 600 years of Islam. The 50% were Muslim. That meant that most of the population of Syria, or anyway half of it, were not Muslim when the Crusaders arrived in Syria. And so then one might well wonder why the Crusaders weren't more successful in establishing their state if the population was more than 50% non-Muslim, and that non-Muslim population was was very largely Christian, because the Jewish population, although present, was a small population. And the answer to that is that the Eastern Christians were not in communion with the Western Christians and tremendously resented the heavy-handed attempts of the Franks to establish their ecclesiastical dominance, and sided with the Muslims. And so the Crusaders got no benefit from the Eastern Christians, except for the Maronites of Lebanon, who united with the Catholic Church at that point and helped in the county of Tripoli, but they were only a little group. Okay. And In Pakistan, the area that became Pakistan, especially the area of Sindh, which is southern Pakistan around Karachi, the population of the kingdom of Sindh had been largely Buddhist, a Buddhist majority and a Hindu minority. And within 200 years of the conquest, the Buddhist majority had vanished and had all become Muslims. So there was something odd about Buddhists tended to join Islam when Islam arrived, and that has constantly been repeated in history almost everywhere. Whereas the Hindus resisted. If the Hindus were about 40% of the population of Sindh at the time of the Muslim conquest, by 1900 or so, they were 25% of the population of Sindh. Today, they're not present there much because there was an exchange of populations when India and Pakistan separated in 1947. But in other words, the less than half of the Hindus became Muslims over a period of 1,200 years, whereas the Buddhists just switched to Islam like that. And that had nothing to do with Buddhism not being allowed or anything like that, because all of the religions outside of Arabia were allowed. Yes?
Have seen greater conversion to Islam amongst the lower castes in Hindus?
Yes, you did, but it wasn't exclusively that, because sometimes upper caste people were well placed to become officials and cooperate with the Muslims, and in that situation some of them became Muslims too. But on the whole, that is undoubtedly true. And remember, the people of Pakistan, pre-modern Pakistan, of ancient Sindh, were Buddhists because that area being on the northwest side of India was identified by the Hindu Brahmins as being an impure area. So they were of very low status in the caste system of India, and that was what persuaded them to be Buddhists. And apparently that hadn't worked, because when the Muslims came to Sindh, there was a Hindu king ruling over the Buddhist population. So the Hindu king was defeated in only 2 battles, and the Buddhists opened the gates of all the cities and welcomed the Muslims coming, or because they had been in a struggle with the Hindus before there. Furthermore, when Islam spread down the Ganges Valley, when the Muslim raiders, I should say, who were Central Asian Turks that had recently become Muslims, went down the Ganges Valley and plunged deep into India, the remaining Buddhist population there were the people of Bangladesh. And they were people who, because they lived at the eastern end of India and had been originally a forest people there, and were reached by Hinduism later than the rest of India, they were not incorporated into the system. The Hindu system had the 3 Indo-European castes, which were the Brahmins, who were the priests, the Kshatriyas, that were the nobles and warriors, and the Vaishyas, who were the commoners. And that Vaishya Varna, or group of castes, was later reinterpreted as meaning the middle class, so to speak. This is merchants and so on. And then the Shudras, they were the native Dravidian people. So they've created a 4th group, and that became the Shudra group. And they were the Dravidian people that were there. But once this system became fixed, any other areas that came in after that had no caste, and they became the untouchables. So all the people of eastern Bengal were untouchables. And they found that intolerable and joined Buddhism, which was a kind of protest movement against Brahmanism in Hinduism. And then they, when Islam came, they joined Islam. And that is why you have this population of 1/10 of all the Muslims in the world living in this little tiny poor country of Bangladesh at the mouth of the Ganges River, isolated totally from the rest of the world, the Muslim world, by Hindu-dominated India and so on. So you have this very odd phenomenon that you must have wondered about if you ever saw Muslim population concentrations on a map, how it is that the Bangladesh people became Muslim. That's how. They had been Buddhist. And so that's sort of an illustration of something about how Islam spread in the world. Now, if we went along on these maps to move along, let's see, this is, yes, if we go to pages 80, 81, even though these maps are frankly all much of a sameness. But anyway, here you will observe that the big purple area is the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks were the first Turks who came to rule in their own right. A political characteristic of most of the medieval Muslim states, which is extremely odd and nevertheless factual, is that usually the Muslim states were ruled, had as their armies professional soldiers who were imported from beyond the borders of the Muslim countries and were not Muslims to begin with, but were imported as children, male children, boys, and brought up as Muslims, and then they became the armies, the basic armies of each place. And this was called the Mamluk system. Mamluk means possessed or owned, and so it's like slave soldiers. But it's a system of slavery that's very strange because it isn't chattel slavery, really. Rather, these people became the elite of the country. So, in other words, slaves were imported, and they were brought up as Muslims, and then they became the military soldiers, but they also became the commanders. This happened very early. The Caliph Mu'tasim, who ruled from 833 to 841, had a Turkish mother, and he imported the Turks and liked them, and that started a tradition that continued and continued and continued. Who were the Turks? The Turks were Central Asian people that lived way out in Central Asia. Today, if you look at the Turkic-speaking peoples, the major Turkic languages and peoples include the Turks of Turkey, the Azeris, who are Azerbaijani Turks, who speak, and those two groups, by the way, as well as the Turks of Turkmenistan, or the Turkomans, those three groups speak Oghuz, which is one variety of Turkish. So those three languages are nearly mutually comprehensible. Then there's the Jagatai Turks, who include the Uzbeks of Uzbekistan and the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, which is Chinese Turkestan. And then there are the Kipchak Turks, and those are the Kyrgyz, the Kazakhs, the Karakalpaks, the Tatars, and the Bashkirs. And all of the Turkish languages are somewhat mutually comprehensible because the Turkish diaspora has only happened in the last 1,000 years. And because of that, although that's enough time to elaborate them into different languages somewhat, there's also a great deal of similarity between all of the Turkish languages. And naturally, that has interested modern Turkey lately with the independence of the formerly Soviet-ruled Turkic republics to heavily go into that area and try to influence it. And the Turks' original homeland is in northeast Kazakhstan, toward the direction of Mongolia, both in Kazakhstan and beyond it to the northeast. And so the original ethnic appearance of the original Turks is that of the Kazakhs. And the Kazakh language is sometimes considered to be sort of the pure type of the Turkish language. But in any case, the Turks came from that area, and what is now called Turkestan, places like Bukhara, Samarkand, and so on, in Uzbekistan, all of that area was Iranian, not Turkish originally. But the Turks came in from being pastoral nomads and having the population surplus. They constantly migrated inward from the Central Asian steppes, and eventually their language prevailed. So today, the remaining Persian language is spoken in northern Afghanistan, in Tajikistan largely, in some isolated pockets in Uzbekistan and in Iran, of course. But everywhere else, the Turkish language has prevailed in that area, or one of the varieties of Turkish. And the Turks were then being imported as slave soldiers, but when the Seljuks came starting in 1037, they captured Nishapur. They captured it in their own right, and they set up their own rule, which was called the Seljuk Sultanate. And here, in the purple color, it shows how far it extended when it was at its largest extent.
I have a question about related to the slave trade. I had a guest speaker who's about a 60-year-old African-American man, and he was responding to a question from one of my students. And my student asked him why he had been attracted to Islam. And what he said was that even though earlier in his life he had joined the Nation of Islam and become familiar with Islam and beyond that traditional Islam, that he was really reticent about it because he had learned, and I didn't have the background to know this, because he had learned of the history of Muslim enslavement of Africans. And then he got really graphic with my kids, and he said that along with the raiding of the African countries for slave labor, that one of the things they would do is castrate young boys in order to take them back to Muslim countries so that they could serve as eunuchs in the harems. And it was done very crudely, and he said that 15% of the boys are all that would survive the castration, and he was bitter. But I didn't have the background to know.
Well, I don't think there's any basis for knowing about that. But of course, it's true that there were, some eunuchs, but that wasn't by any means, masses of slaves that were made into eunuchs. That would be a few, perhaps. And furthermore, that's not regarded as legitimate in the Islamic law. That's not allowed. And the slave trade and the history of slavery, of course, that's something that existed throughout human history until the 19th century, except for a few places. Norway is proud to say it was the first place to prohibit and abolish slavery, which it claims it did, I think, about 1200 or something like that. Which may or may not be the case. I don't know the details of that point. I've just seen that has been said. But the fact that slavery existed, that's true. And you can, try to euphemize with some other word or something like that. But with regard to the African Americans, of course, this is a battleground, and it is a major card played by Christian polemicists in the attempt to stop the spread of Islam amongst the African Americans. And it has not worked to date at all. And Pat Robertson said on his program, he said, I can't understand why any African American would become a Muslim. That is a religion of slavery of them, and that is totally stupid. Something like that. And of course, if he says that will just encourage people to become Muslims because of the actual dialectic of the thing, the situation. But on the other hand, Afrocentrists, of course, who are extremely anti-Muslim, make this claim. And they, be more the protagonist, what you call the effective protagonists of the argument on this point. Nevertheless, from the time that the famous West Indian Edward Wilmot Blyden went to Africa and wrote his book about the Islam, Christianity, and the Africans. Even though he went as a Presbyterian missionary to Liberia, ran in the election for president of Liberia in about, 1885 or so, and was the Liberian ambassador to England and France. By the end of his life, he is thought to have become a crypto-Muslim, and he wrote a book in about 1887 in which he said, Islam is better for African people than Christianity. And that, I think, has been the consensus after that. And better in what sense? Well, it's true that there was a slave trade, and the slave trade undoubtedly involved a lot of horrors over its existence. And that would be true of Greek slavery, which is often not featured when we're talking about ancient Greece, and the fact that a huge proportion of the population of supposedly democratic Athens were slaves, maybe as much as a quarter, in fact. Or what I call often the Great Slave Empire, the Roman Empire, which had massive slavery that was really horrible. And usually when I'm trying to judge whether I should use an ancient history textbook or not, I look and I see, what does this book say about the destruction of the two cities of Corinth and Carthage, two of the world cities, by the Romans in the same year, 146 BC, which is often written in books that this was an object lesson to the Greeks, that they destroyed Corinth. Corinth was destroyed as an object lesson. I mean, come on, give me a break. Talk about biased language. There's a world city the Romans destroyed in their awful conquests. And the other thing I look for is, what do they say about Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the famous Hellenized consul, who is featured as one of the people who is in one of Plutarch's lives in the biographies, carrying off 150,000 people as slaves from Epirus in the year 167 BC, when Epirus was not even a party to the war he was fighting. He just went into a neutral country and carried off a third of the population. So I'm affected by that too, but one does have to realize that in Muslim history and all of these other histories that existed, there was, in fact, slavery. In the texts of Islam, slavery is acknowledged, but obedience to masters is not. It is found in the Hadith, however, and that is quasi-scriptural, or even you could say scriptural if you wanted, I think. And in Christianity, of course, in the letter of the Ephesians, I think, is slaves obey your masters. So Christianity is under the gun for that too, in the same respect. And it seems to me that the only great difference is this between chattel slavery in the American South and Muslim slavery in the history of Islam. And that is that in Islam, an extremely high value is placed on the paternity of the children. Knowing who the father of the child is matters a lot. That is one of the reasons that marriage is required. It is one of the reasons that polygamy exists. It is one of the reasons that there was concubinage, because if a man was going to sleep around, the idea was he should only sleep around with whom he could sleep with legitimately, and the children ought to be known for their father, who the father is. And furthermore, there was also a principle which is embedded in Roman and most other law, which is that the child belongs to the marriage bed. In other words, there is an automatic supposition, if a woman is married, that the father is her husband, unless it is brought out in a case that has to be tried somehow to prove other than that. And in fact, in the Hadith, it even says the child belongs to the marriage bed and the adulterer gets the stone, referring to the prohibition of adultery, leading to adultery being actually a kind of capital crime. Although, as Hamza Yusuf said, the standards of proof were so severe that it was more a rule against public fornication than it was a rule against adultery behind closed doors, because the standards of evidence were very strict. So anyhow, you have the idea of legitimacy of the children that's very much embedded, and the necessity of the father acknowledging the children. And that was what was different with chattel slavery in the American South in particular. And where instead you have this kind of color bar race line where you view these African people are like inferior race. They're like dogs or cattle, or they're not even human beings. That was upheld, indeed. And that partly arose out of the Western mind being convinced of pseudoscientific ideas or transferring the fundamentalism of science into the area of social relations and applying it, and that kind of result ensued. In Islam, though, that didn't obtain. The children of the union always were belonged to the father, and consequently, the mother's background didn't influence whether the child was legitimate or not. But the child was legitimate provided that the woman was, whether she was wife or a slave concubine. Yes?
You seem to suggest that there has been an inequity of blame for slavery. Perhaps more of a focus on Islamic history, Islamic cultures, Islamic kingdoms, as opposed to, say, Greek and Rome. And I've been teaching world history since 1982, and I've never had a textbook that has failed to mention the huge number of slaves that were used in the building of Athens, for instance.
Okay.
None
well,
of
I
them
don't
was-
mind. I mean, I'm not suggesting that that isn't
For your
featured.
information, just to let you know that.
Well, I've taught ancient history many times.
No,
And I know that that is found in textbooks of history. But often when you have something like a great books course, like our Intellectual Heritage series at Temple University, where we read the plays of Sophocles and so on like that, and you know, a kind of discourse about Greece being the legitimate origin of Western civilization is carried on. And Greece had slavery at Athens, and that's not neglected, I grant you that. Even when I went to high school, well over 35 years ago, that was mentioned. I mean, even in the time before we have modern political correctness, that was mentioned. But it still is not sufficiently emphasized how nationalistic too the ancient Greeks were, how, what in a manner they colonized the Middle East and Egypt, for example, the type of relationship that existed in Egypt between the Greek colonizers and the native Egyptians, which was a case of extreme inegalitarianism. That I don't think gets enough emphasis, partly because, of course, the whole Eastern Mediterranean just is not of interest in Western history courses often, because once Alexander the Great is done, you would say something about Alexandria being a center of Greek science, and Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth and something like that, and then that's about it. And then Egypt fades from history.
How would the formal acknowledgement of the paternity of the slave influence the slave's life? Because there's no difference. You see what I'm looking for?
Well, it would influence the slave's life. A woman who gave birth to a child could not be sold. So she acquired a status that wasn't quite the status of a full wife, but she had a status where she could not be sold any longer by the owner. And that became a rule. And so she became an Umweled, see. And why couldn't she be sold? Because it wouldn't be suitable, of course, to sell the mother of your child. That would be an outrage. And so that wasn't allowed at all. And the children followed the father. So if the father was freeborn, the children were freeborn, period. And they were his children, and they were, in the sight of the law, equal to the other children. Now, granted that in the Ummayid dynasty, the children of the slave women were not allowed to become caliphs except the last two caliphs. And that was at the time when there was disorder. Before that, it was the Arab women, mothers of the caliphs, and in fact, not just any ones, but the ones who came from the most noble lineages. But then often that's been the case with royal lineages in history. I mean, in Europe, you know, the man had to marry a princess if he was the king. He couldn't marry a commoner, generally speaking. Now, in the East Roman Empire, that wasn't the case, but in most of Western European royalty, that has always been the case. They had to marry a noble, and it's only been in this century that that rule has been contravened. And in fact, there was the morganitic marriage, which was that the noble would give the woman what was morganitic comes from a word meaning a mourning gift, who was a commoner, on the understanding that her children would inherit none of his titles and rights because she was a commoner. And also you had cases like Augustus III, who was the king of Saxony and Poland, who had 300 children. and they were almost all illegitimate. Many of the kings had huge numbers of illegitimate children. I think it was Henry I of England had about 17 or 18 illegitimate children. And so there was not legitimacy because the king had the power to go around to do what he wanted, unlike our present presidents, and don't get away with it. And the king doing that, the children were not thereby legitimated. Now, what this matters as far as race relations goes means that the children of black women who might have been slave concubines were just as legitimate as anybody else, and consequently, they became rulers. So, Al-Malik al-Salih Najm ad-Din Ayyub, who was the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, who ruled from 1240 to 1249, was black. He was a black ruler. He was the one who made the arrangements to fight against Louis IX in the Sixth Crusade. He defeated the Crusaders. And he was a black ruler. And there were other rulers of that nature. And as I think I had already said, the Crown Prince of Kuwait today is that. The late King of Morocco, whom I met many times, Al-Hassan II, was not black in a black African sense, but he obviously had ancestry that came from south of the Sahara Desert. President Sadat of Egypt, President Mohammed Naguib of Egypt, the present Saudi ambassador to Washington, Bandar ibn Sultan, who is the son of the second crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and so on. So that then produced a different effect, even if there was oppression in slavery to begin with. The other thing is, slavery is not legal in any Muslim country today, and there is no mechanism for acquiring slaves legitimately today. So it is considered today to be a dead letter in the religion of Islam. Yes.
Two more questions. The first one is the more important one too. And so why I'm asking. In the American South, there were some laws on the books that were pretty nice in terms of slave rights, but they were not held up in practice. Now I'm thinking about myself. You know, if I had a slave and I'm the father, I'd have a very strong economic motivation to deny my paternity so that I could sell that child. So what I'm asking is, were these laws upheld?
Yes, they were generally upheld. Because you look all over the Muslim world, see, there's no color bar in Islam. There never was a color bar. There's no color bar racism in Islam. There is, of course, as has been said, a tendency in some of the discourses that have emanated from the Muslim civilization to prefer the lighter color to the darker. And there has also been the contrary of that, the exact opposite. But there isn't any color bar in the sense of we're white and you're black, and that's a border. And remember, even in the United States, in the American South, there were ambiguous people. There were blacks who were so white that they looked whiter than some of the whites looked. And there were whites who had slave ancestry, as was sarcastically said once in the State Assembly of South Carolina, that someone said, I don't think there is a single person sitting here who doesn't have some African ancestry. And that was in some kind of debate, and he was just being mean to his fellow legislators. But anyway, that was in the white period when there were no black legislators, the Jim Crow period. And so anyway, that was the response to that.
My curiosity question. What if I speak with your slave and a child is produced? Does she remain your property, or do I have an obligation then to buy her? I'm the father of...
Well, if that's certain, yes, you do. You have the obligation to acquire her in that case. But that's only theoretical, mind you, because this is not something that exists now. It really doesn't exist now. It's true that it was only abolished in Mauritania in 1980 and in Saudi Arabia in 1962, but it's not legal. It's not legal in the legal system of any place, and the abolition of it is acknowledged by all of the Muslim jurists.
But they handled it that way? I mean, in the past, I know we're talking about the past. They handled it, I'd be obliged to buy from you?
I think that's exactly right.
How complicated that could be if you were the father of other children by her.
Oh, yeah. So what if,
I mean, this gets.
Well,
this
see,
is all
then it would be
theoretical.
adultery in that case. It would become like a species of adultery. And on the whole, I think in the discussion we ought to remind ourselves, though, that most of the Muslims that have ever lived have been monogamous, that there isn't such an excess supply of women over men in the world, that men can generally have more than one wife, and that works. And generally, it hasn't been possible to have more than one wife, and that's usually been the prevailing system that has existed in the Muslim world. Also, one has to recognize, with regard to the African American and the African dimension, that 1/6 of the Muslims are Africans from south of the Sahara Desert. They have appropriated Islam for themselves, and they use it for themselves. And amongst the texts that are used, for example, are a fact that suggests that there may have been prevalent color prejudice before Islam, is that there are a lot of Islamic texts that say something in praise of the blacks, and that mention that such and such a companion of the Prophet was black. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was said to be black, and Bilal is the famous Ethiopian who was black, and Ammar ibn Yasir was black, and Usama ibn Zayd was black, and Abdullah ibn Khazim was black, and so on, etc., etc. There's also a very charming story of Antar, who was a pre-Islamic poet, Arabian poet, who was black because his mother was black, he was black, and so it's a romance between Antar and Abla, and he faced some kind of discrimination on that and overcame it, and that became one of the 3 main popular sagas that were sung in the Arab world until recently.
just one little piece, because there are only a couple of other American history teachers among us, but you know how the book that we read in prep said that perhaps as many as 20% of African slaves that were brought to the New World were Muslim. And previous to that, the Amistad incident is a piece of Connecticut history. One of the things that the lawyers, and I'm not sure if it was Roger Sherman Baldwin at that point, but one of the ways that, because if you've seen the Amistad movie, you know that the key point was, were they born in Africa or were they born in Cuba before 1820? And one of the things that was used in court to try to prove that they were from Africa is that there were among the Amistad captives those who recognized and responded to Islamic prayers. So there were Muslims in that group of people, and that was brought out in court. It was used in court to help prove that they were from Africa and could not possibly have been from Cuba before 1820, because the incident happened in 1839, and the idea is that their Muslim understanding would have been crushed had they been actual Cuban slaves for the last 20 years.
Okay. So anyway, we got up to the Seljuk Turkish move into the area, and I was talking about how the Turks came in, and the Seljuk Turks just went on and defeated the East Roman Empire in 1071, which led to its rapid collapse after that. Even though Constantinople held out until 1453, actually the Western Crusaders came and helped the East Roman Empire at first to restore itself, and then they destroyed it or conquered it in the Fourth Crusade, and it's very complicated. But anyway, the thing was that the Seljuk Turks really broke the East Roman Empire, and that also introduced the Turks into Anatolia and eventually into Europe. And the pattern that had existed elsewhere seemed to take place in Anatolia as well. The people joined Islam. And why exactly they did that after having been Greek for so long is not entirely clear, even though there's a very nice, long, detailed book by Sparos Vrionis, who is a Greek-American historian, The Decline of Hellenism in Medieval Asia Minor, in which he deals with that very question and shows openly that even though he's a Greek and is bemoaning this terrible disaster to the Greek nation, as he sees it. Nevertheless, he quite honestly records that the people simply embraced Islam by conversion over a long period of about 3 centuries, and that was entirely a voluntary move. And even some of the princes from the imperial family went over and became Muslims and changed their religion. Apparently, the East Roman Empire had become rather oppressively feudalistic in the period just before that, and that had encouraged this move. On the whole, one has to say that when I said that, of course, conversion was not forced, well, there are some caveats to that. Like, once a person is a Muslim, they're not allowed to revert to another religion. And apostasy, as in Christianity throughout medieval times, was a capital offense. And so it was in Islam, and so it was in Christianity throughout the medieval times of the church. And it was not in Judaism, because in Judaism, rather, they had the decree of cherem, or boycott, that the person, if they apostatized, was considered as if they'd become dead to the community. And so they would cut them off, as they made a decree against the, what shall I say, perhaps pantheistic philosopher Spinoza, but they did not have it as a capital crime. But so there was then a certain demand for conformity, yes, that occurred. But I would even so maintain that if the religion did not have its own internal virtues for most of the people, it still would have collapsed, laws like that or not, long before. And furthermore, although the law is not lifted out of the Islamic law, so to speak, but in effect it doesn't exist, or it didn't exist in the colonial period in particular, when most of the Muslim world came under British and French and Russian rule. During that time, it was open season on Islam. Missionaries came in to preach Christianity to the Muslims, and the reputation of Islam was that the Muslims were completely unshakable and absolutely refused to change their religion in general. So obviously, Islam, for most of the Muslims, had some kind of benefits that were accruing and that the people were seeing. Part of the benefit could have been salvation in the other world. That is the teaching of the religion, after all. God has bought the believers because he has given them paradise. See? But on the other hand, it may be also that Islam was felt to belong to the people. It was the ideological possession of the people. It was not the possession of the government. And that was the most effective aspect of keeping it in the hands of the people. Now, inside this vast area of the central Islamic lands, there is a lot more to say, after all. And that is that several different schemes of authority arose, and that also arose in opposition to attempts to assert authority. So the first assertion of authority was the caliphate. That is, the caliph is elected, has the right to rule. He is the supreme judge and arbiter of the religion, even though he does not have divine inspiration, because that was clearly and definitively cut off with the prophet's death. There was not going to be any further revelation of laws and so on. Yes?
How about this, though? In 1453, let's go there. Mm-hmm. And you've got Janissaries climbing the wall, screaming and crying, and horrible scene. And there's an attack going on of the sovereign state. Is there Quranic justification for that?
Well, there's been a long-standing war between the East Roman Empire and the Ottoman Turks. And they were generally in a state of war. So it hadn't been like there was a state of peace and then there was an unjustified Pearl Harbor or something. But quite aside from that, the city of Constantinople, although there was still an East Roman emperor in it, was primarily under the domination, if I remember correctly, of the Italian city of Genoa. And there were also hostile relations between Genoa and the Ottoman Turks, so it was war.
So yes.
Yes, what?
The question was, is there Quranic justification for 1453?
Well, Well, it
famous
was
debate that
definitely
the
justified,
profane
yes. According to that, it was justified. It was justified, no doubt, by the religious scholars that the Turks had with them at the time, whoever they may have been, and I don't know that, and it was justified by themselves. But whether you were asking me now, in my latter day time when we have completely different concepts of things, whether or not that was politically correct, I would rather demur and not answer it. And I wouldn't say one way or another, because why should I? It's something that happened, and that's that. I don't see that I need to make a value judgment against these people in the past, although you should have acquired from my lecture generally that I don't think highly of either politicians or political states. And that is general, and I think that I'm quite fair on that point, in the sense that I generally don't think highly in the whole of politicians and political states at all. Now, I was going to explain these lineages of authority. Maybe I should erase this and write this down. The lineages of authority in Islam all go back to the Prophet. Well, actually, they go back to Allah, or God, say. And then Prophet Muhammad received the revelation from God. That was a sufficient situation at the beginning. Of course, then you're going to have here the Muslims under some kind of authority, or trying to trace back upward from themselves some kind of authority that goes to God. So the first thing you have is the caliphate. Now, the caliphate traces its authority both to Muhammad, because Abu Bakr was thought to be the legitimate ruler after Muhammad, and according to some, Muhammad didn't appoint a successor, and the caliphs simply were elected as a consensus of the Muslim people. But according to Aisha, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr and the Prophet's wife, Muhammad kind of appointed Abu Bakr as caliph. But also there was a suggestion that it was God's caliph and that there was a direct connection with God, albeit not one that allowed the revelation of new laws or new sunnahs. The sunnahs all had to go back to the Prophet Muhammad. And this led to a dead end, because the caliphate doesn't exist anymore, and it suffered from the phenomenon of the crumbling of charisma, because it was ensconced in power, and the exercise of power was illegitimate. Furthermore, once the caliphate was cut off in 661 by the death of Ali, the canonical election of the caliphs was considered to have lapsed. So any caliphate after that was ad hoc and illegitimate. And the further coups that happened later against the caliphs broke that legitimacy even more, until eventually the institution became nothing and finally vanished from the earth. So the caliphate did not prove to be an enduring source of authority. So what were the sources of authority? Another lineage of authority sought to find authority in a physical lineage of imams who could be described as the imams of the Shia. And those were lineal descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. The first imam was Ali, the Prophet's first cousin and son-in-law, the husband of Fatima. But because Ali married Fatima, the couple's children, their sons, were the Prophet's grandsons. And so the lineage descended from the Prophet came from that lineage. And the Shia claim was a very simple political one. The caliphs have goofed up, and their rule is not legitimate, and if only we put our imams in office, everything would be perfect. And so that was their claim of authority. And naturally, this was not welcomed by the caliphs, who pursued the imams and sometimes murdered them. And finally, after 12 imams had been exhausted, one of the imams went into occultation in the year 874. That means he became no longer visible to his followers at all. And from that time to the present, the Shia have believed that their imam is the hidden imam who is either in a kind of suspended animation and then comes back at the end to institute a rule of righteousness, or that he's still in a state of waking consciousness wandering around the earth, never dying or aging by God's protection and will. And so that was their claim to authority. The political claim of the Shia didn't work, though, because as often as it was raised, it had resulted in failure. It didn't come to fruition. That is, there was never the rule of any Shia imam except Ali, who was only caliph for 5 years, and whose reign was filled with wars and problems. So there was another kind of authority, which was the authority of the Sunnah. So the Sunnah and its interpreters or transmitters. Those said, yes, we go to the authority of the prophet, but we don't go to the authority of his descendants. We give that up and abandon and ignore that. He didn't give any preference to anybody, the prophet, but rather he left behind him the book, and he left what he did, which we now record. And at the same time, interestingly, that this happened, that the Shi'is gave up their political claims by saying that the imam is in occultation. At that very same time, the very exact same time, the Sunnis were assiduously writing down the hadiths. You'll remember Dr. Shafi'i was telling you that all of these canonical collections of hadith were recorded by people who were born in about a 20-year period. And that was the time when they were flourishing and writing down rapidly. So this became more of a line of textual authority. So this could be called legitimist. This could be called textual. So you have a kind of a textual authority. And that issued in two different types of interpretations, one of which was fiqh, which was the interpretationist view. And the other was hadith, which was the traditionist view, or transmitted tradition. And these were just two nuances of the thing. And of course, the two borrowed heavily from each other. So the concepts of one were borrowed by the concepts of the other. And while this became known as the Shia over here, this became known as the Sunnis. So the Sunni Muslims came from that group. Then another kind of authority arose after that. All of these authorities were very anti-statist. The Shia were anti-statist because the Shia were rarely in power anywhere. And when they were in power, the Shia usually went out against whoever it was that claimed they were the legitimate imam, as the Fatimids. So the Fatimids had very little popular support even with Shi'i people. Or Shi'i people came to power who weren't imams, but they said, we're Shia, and we're not claiming to be imams or anything, but we support the Shia. And usually the Shia religious leaders seceded from those and deserted them as well, and so they didn't get any popularity either, as the Buyids, for example. And similarly with the Sunnis, the same thing. The religious leaders minimally cooperated with the rulers, at most accepting a judgeship, but never taking power themselves. Nevertheless, the textual interpretationist authority led some people to think that there was too much legalism and that there was too much emphasis on outward practice that ignored the inner practice. So there was a restoration of another authority, which came, and this is what we'd call mystical authority. And this resulted in it had charismatic sheikhs who were said, in fact, to be not only going back in a lineage that they had learned from Muhammad, but also to have another direct connection with God. That is, they were directly inspired, even though they were not giving any messages out that were new laws or anything. And this became Sufism. And between the years 1000 and 1200, the Sunnis made a big campaign to reincorporate everything in Sunnism. And so they made a lot of concessions to the Shia, praising Ali highly and preferring him to other companions and trying to attract the Shia back. And so some of the Shia were attracted back into Sunnism, but others stayed Shia. And in fact, the ones that were attracted back didn't come from the occultationist lineage. And then, but the Sufi ended up being Sunnis also mainly, although there are also some Shia Sufis, because that's a motif there as well. There, isn't that nice and confusing? Anyway, the main point you have here is there's three kinds of successful authority. Legitimist, which ended up being very sectarian and Shia and defined, and there's about 12% of the Muslims are Shia. They are probably about 93% of the population of Iran, about 80% or more of the population of Azerbaijan, 55% of the population of Iraq or more. 55 to 65% of the population of Iraq are Shia, 70% of the population of Bahrain, 45% of the population of Lebanon. Those are the principal Shia countries. And there is, in addition, a percent of Shia in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. That is a significant percentage, but it probably is in the realm of 10 to 15%, not more. Yes?
What was your percentage on Iraq?
It's 55 to 65%.
Am I the only one? I mean, is this a propaganda thing or just an American? I always thought that the Iran-Iraqi war, among other things, was Sunni Shia.
At least 5/6 of the casualties in the war were Shia, because the troops fighting on both sides were Shia.
So Shia versus Shia.
Yep.
In each of those countries, how was the war, what was the propaganda in those countries to justify the war?
It went like this, that Iran had its revolution. The Iranian Revolution, like it or not, was an enormous popular upheaval and very exciting. And it was something all the population participated in, except for a small upper class who became émigrés, just like the French nobles left France during the French Revolution. In very many senses, the Iranian Revolution is more spectacular than the Russian or Chinese revolutions, and its main parallel would be the French Revolution. And like the French, the Russian, even the Chinese and revolutions, and Cuban and so on, it immediately attracted the enmity and hostility of all conservative powers round about, whether the United States or conservative Muslim countries such as Saudi Arabia. And the Muslim explanation of that war might involve some offense to you. And so consequently, I'm not going to say it. But
We can take it.
no,
We've been offended before.
Well, I'll give you a version of it anyway, where I'll try to palliate that part. But anyway, the country of Iraq was encouraged to attack Iran in 1980. The Iraq was ruled by a megalomaniac and Stalinist dictator, Saddam Hussein, who is still there, who himself represented supposedly the right wing of the so-called Ba'ath, or Arab Renaissance Party. This party had been founded by Michel Aflaq, who is a Syrian Christian. And the whole purpose of the party was to reintegrate the Christians with the Muslims, the Arab Christians and Muslims united. It was in order to have a secularist Arab world where there would be no distinction between Muslim and Christian, nor between Sunni and Shi'i Muslim, but all the citizens of the country would be integrated just like the Christians and Jews were integrated together by the French Revolution in the French revolutionary doctrine. Or, for that matter, as all the various religions are integrated here in this country. So in that sense, the Ba'ath Party's message is an Americanizing one in this particular point. And Michel Aflaq eventually ended up being disliked by the Ba'ath ruler of the left wing of the party, who was Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, and had to take refuge in Iraq, where he died. And so this Christian founder of the Ba'ath Party, the original ideologue of the Ba'ath Party, was celebrated there by Saddam Hussein as, in effect, his ideologue and mentor. Now, the question is why the Ba'ath Party especially became dominant in Iraq, and for that matter in Syria, and what are the details of it? Because the history of those countries coming out of colonialism is very odd. And the answer to that is that the Iraq as a political state is very fragmented in both ethnicity and religion. And these are two possible cements that can be used ideologically for holding together a state. Now, for example, in Algeria, in spite of the civil war there, and in spite of the fact that the Islamists are portrayed as, the evil anti-democratic forces, even though it's they who won the election and were deprived of their victory by the military dictators there, who in French have the attractive name, the Eradicators. Nevertheless, those same Eradicators, who are supposedly anti-Islamist, primarily identify themselves ideologically as Muslim first, Arab second. Why? Because Algerians are 100% Muslim, nominally, but there's a large proportion of Berbers in the population who don't speak Arabic as their native tongue. Consequently, Islamic cement is more effective in holding the country together. Similar cases of religious justifications for ideology include India, where with Hindi language is only 30 to 40%, but Hindu religion is 82%. Therefore, just because of the percents, Hinduism is used now by the dominant political party there as the cement to hold India together, something that is of great disadvantage to the 120 million Indian Muslims. And similarly in Iran, where you have only 45% Persian speaking and 93% Shia, Islam, especially its Shi'i form, seems to be a very good cement ideologically to hold together a country which otherwise is threatened by the same process of national disintegration that destroyed Austria-Hungary and the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and threatens to destroy Ethiopia and so on. That is, multilingual states have a hard time staying together. And so Iraq had about 55 to 65% Shia, and that would seem to provide a basis for unity, but it's not really quite enough. And then the rulers have been, since the British established Iraq as a country in 1920, Sunnis. So you have, say, 65%, well, let's call it 60% Shia, and then you have about 3% Christian, which are a variety of different Christian groups. And some of the Christians are very prominent. For example, Tariq Aziz Hanna Abdel Masih. You recognize Tariq Aziz, the Iraqi foreign minister? Christian, not a Muslim. Who already knew that? Okay. And the Kurds constitute 20% of the population of Iraq. They are Sunni Muslims, but they are not Arabic speaking. So it breaks down like 20% Sunni Muslim Kurds, 3% Arabic speaking Christians, 60% Arabic speaking Shia, and now what's left? 17% Arabic speaking Sunnis? That's Saddam Hussein's group. He has darn little communal support. And does he have the loyalty of that community? Pretty much. Even the religious leaders of the Sunnis are quite alarmed in their long confrontation with Shi'ism in Iraq about the possibility of a Shi'i dominance, even as horrid as Saddam Hussein is, because he is really, really bad. And if you want to read a couple of truthful books about him, because there's a lot of garbage on the market that is just ignorant journalistic propaganda that is totally worthless. But there are two very relevant, good books, and you will not find them saying one nice word about Saddam Hussein. One is The Republic of Fear, which was written by Kanan Makiya, he had a pen name. The real name of the person is Kanan Makiya. But his pen name is Samir al-Khalil because he was afraid that he would be assassinated. And so, in other words, I've met him. He came to University of Pennsylvania. He's an Iraqi immigrant, but he's also a very well-educated postmodernist. And so his criticism of Saddam Hussein is completely in terms of postmodernism, just like Michel Foucault. What's going on here? So he has The Republic of Fear, in which he demonstrates how in Iraq the situation is such that the tyrant is so tyrannical that nobody will tell him the truth about anything. Everyone has gotten it down to a science of telling him what he wants to hear, so he lives in a fantasy world. And not only that, but the people do too, because the people, by telling them the things over and over again, also end up living in a kind of fantasy world. And he has a second book which is called The Monument. And this is about a vainglorious monument to the Iran-Iraq war that Saddam Hussein has constructed in Baghdad. And in it, there is a criticism of the art and architecture of modern Iraq, which is held up to utter ridicule. And it is a very worthwhile thing to read anyhow in considering modern architecture in general and Iraqi in specific. So to portray it as a Sunni-Shi'i conflict, the ruler of Iraq is Sunni, and the Iranian Revolution, although it was said to be Islamic in general, had a Shi'i emphasis. Imam Khomeini in Iran said, "O Muslims, unite, unite." And he commanded several changes in Shi'ism, which were extremely dramatic as major, major changes in the religion itself, which helped to make the Shia closer to the Sunnis in practice. One of them was he restored the Friday prayers, which had been not in existence for centuries. And that was a complete, utter, extreme reversal of things. To do that was a spectacular change. Now, in the war itself, and what emerged was, of course, Saddam Hussein was terrified by this huge revolution in Iran, which was filled with popular enthusiasm. When he was a nasty dictator sitting on, say, 17% of the population that he could count on, having fought the Kurds in various wars already, because the Kurds had been trying to secede and so on, so although they were Sunnis, they were no help. And having the Christians on his side because of Baathism and the idea of integrating the Christians, that he was able to have them on his side too. But to have all this Shi'i population against him, that was terrible. And so he did everything he could to fix things. And he said, well, our ideology is Arab. When I was in Iraq under his early rule in 1971, they have these big banners everywhere. Ummatun Arabiyyatun wahidatun dhatu risalatin khalida. He had taken this slogan, which belonged to the pan-Islamists of the 19th century, which in its Islamic form meant one Muslim community, the possessor of an everlasting message. And he had changed the word Muslim to Arab. One Arab community, the possessor of an everlasting message. And people holding this up to ridicule would say, and what message is that? If it's just Arab nationalism, what is its message possibly? What could that be? And Arab nationalism, because, if I may, of the many unsuccessful wars and confrontations with Israel had been discredited. And so here he was going into this era with this a huge revolution next door in a neighbor that was 3 times as populous as his country. And, he was terrified. And so he thought, well, we have to do something. And certain foreign intelligence agencies went to him and said, the time is ripe. Attack right now. In other words, they tried to sic Iraq on Iran. And that was very much like how the British in 1792 cleverly stood aside and worked behind the scenes to get Prussia and Austria to attack the French Revolution, much to the chagrin of Prussia and Austria, and as the thing turned out. And the same thing happened here when the Iraqis went in. They had been told the Arab-speaking part of Iran, which is the southwest corner where all the oil is, Khuzestan, because that has a majority Arabic-speaking population. That will come over to you. And then when Iran doesn't have any oil, it will have no money and it won't be able to fight any war, and it will collapse and disintegrate into all its tribal and geographical units. And the Iranians had nothing, just like the French revolutionaries, exactly identically the same. The officer corps had left the country. And the military forces were in complete chaos in Iran. And so it looked like Iraq, with its large army, could attack. But unfortunately, what they forgot, unlike the armies of Prussia and Austria when they attacked France and were able to operate in it, Iraq had no logistical capability of operating more than, say, 20 kilometers beyond its border. And so the Iraqi armies all just came to a stop. And furthermore, the Revolutionary Guards fought back with such enthusiasm that the Iraqis were stopped. And within 2 years defeated, and the Iranians entered Iraq instead. Then the surprising part happened, which was that the Iranians expected that Iraq would then collapse, and it didn't. And the Iraqi government used extreme methods of suppression to cow the Shi'i population of Iraq, including executing Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, who was one of the major ulama of the Shia in Iraq, was executed with his sister in 1980. And naturally, in propaganda, Iraq had to portray this war as something. And what they did was they portrayed it as Arab against Persian. That was the main theme. They brought back the Battle of Qadisiyah, where the ancient Persian Empire had been defeated in 637 in the initial Muslim conquests. And so they portrayed the Iranians as being outside the pale of Arabism. But Saddam Hussein also had to kowtow somewhat to the prevailing Islamic trend, as the Iranians had taken the imperial lion off the Iranian flag and instead written a stylized form of Allahu Akbar, God is greatest, on the flag, which is part of the call to prayer, and is a shout, furthermore, that was used whenever any great event is happening or a battle cry in Islam. Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. Saddam Hussein oddly took his little 3-striped flag with 3 stars in it, and between the 2 stars on each side of the central star wrote Allahu Akbar. In other words, the Iraqi dictator in the middle of the war copied the Iranian flag verbatim to respond that we too are the Muslim side. And having all those Shi'is there, of course he did not emphasize the Shi'i-Sunni split in the war. So that was never a theme at all. I'm being called on to stop. I think I've outworn my welcome.